I'm Rhyddian. I work for Citi. I'm the head of the open source program office at Citi and also chair of the governing board at FINOS. I'm the Citi board director. Long-standing work with FINOS over the years. I was the board director for FINOS at JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. So been involved in FINOS for a very, very long time. And if you joined this morning's welcome session, you may have heard me waxing lyrical about open source readiness. Because the open source readiness group has been a huge accelerator for us at Citi, as well as the practical help that it gives, the power of simply being able to say, here's how everybody else does it in the regulated risk-averse industry that we're in. It can't be underestimated how powerful that's been to unlock with some of the key areas that you have to deal with within regulated industries. So things like audit and compliance and legal and risk and all of those people that are worried about you giving away some of our software and our people actually sending stuff outside the bank. That's all very scary. So being open source readiness has been a massive accelerator. And so this is why a few months back, we open sourced our policy. We open sourced it for the members meeting in London, actually. And if you'd like to have a look at it, it's on our OSPO site. Is it listed there? Yeah, it is. GitHub, Citi OSPO site. We got it there. It was fairly well received, which was good. It generated a lot of conversations about why we do what we do. And so absolutely encourage you to go and have a look at it. But what we found was, when we talked a lot about what we were doing, how we'd structured the policy, the things that were in our policy, many of the questions were around how and why, particularly around the why. And so what this session is really about here is why we chose to do it, the way that we chose to do it. Hopefully that will help you with your journey. So today I'd like to walk you through that and give you some insights. So 53% of financial insurance organizations have no clear open source contribution policy. This was last year's. Hopefully it's improved. I'd like to add another statistic to this one, which is Martin Woodward, who was VP of Developer Relations at GitHub, said open source software is the foundation of 99% of the world's software. And I mentioned this morning as well. So there's another question. How much of the software running in your organizations is open source? Linux, Kubernetes, Istio, Postgres, MongoDB, TensorFlow, Angular, React. We could keep going on. And again, I mentioned this morning. About 5 years ago, Red Hat came out with a statistic that in our types of organizations, 80% of the software that runs in our organizations is open source, which is really interesting. I think it's a lot higher than that. I'm going 90, 95%. Now, you probably have very well-developed procurement processes for buying software. You buy vendor solutions, you ensure the support's included in it. There might be background checks on the viability of the vendor, etc. You may also pay for support, and you may pay for support for some of the major open source solutions that you use, especially if you take them in through the cloud service providers. But the way that we looked at it is if 80% plus of the software running in our company is open source, we need to be involved. We absolutely have to be involved. The risks of not being involved are far too great. For the critical projects, the strategic, the big things, we need a seat at the table. We need engineers who are understanding and potentially influencing the direction of the projects to meet our needs. We need to be able to attract and retain engineering talent. I spoke about this as well, that understand the solutions that we depend on. And that retain is really important. If we want to retain people who are proficient in the open source solutions we use, we've got to let them work in open source. But then there's some other interesting aspects to it around things like supply chain security. Do we understand the level of internal forking that's going on, where engineers are maintaining internal forks of open source software to work around known defects that the community's not yet addressed? we've looked at this, and it's actually quite scary. There's a significant amount of internal forking going on. We came across one team who dedicated about 23% of their annual capacity to maintaining internal forks. That's not fixing the problems in it, that's simply keeping those projects up to date with the versions that are out in the wild. Is a big cost in this and a big risk because they might not. So having this clear policy is essential to identifying and articulating and managing these risks. And at Citi, the policy that we open sourced is how we made managing these risks part of our DNA, part of our engineering organizations. We wanted to make contributing to open source systemic at Citi. This is why the basis of where we start this. And you have to start, if you're going to do this, you've got to start at the top. You've got to start very senior. You've got to start articulating the risks of not being involved, all the reasons why. You've got to get senior buy-in to do this. So we started with some key principles. It has to be a global policy applying to everyone. Regulators, by the way, it's not regulated. The regulators are starting to think about contribution activities. Currently they don't, but there's a lot of other regulation that we have to hit. But regulators hate federated policies. They like to know that an organization has a policy that's enforced across the whole of the organization. So it had to be a global policy that applied to everyone. If we're going to protect the company and realize the benefits, the controls must be applied systemically and the risks defined and managed consistently throughout the whole of the company. Now, this might sound really obvious, but for very large organizations, getting the consensus to do this can be almost impossible. It's a big challenge. But for us, it was essential. As I say, the lens of this is why we did the way we did it. Might be different in your organizations, but this is why we did it. The governance has to be delegated. Now, I mentioned federated. Regulators don't like federated, but it has to be delegated. With companies as large as ours, you've got to keep the decision-making within the constraints of the policy, but you've got to keep that decision-making as close to the relevant teams as possible, the people that really know the subject matter, that understand it. There's no point having the big senior MDs making decisions on things that they really don't know a lot about. It's got to be the people who really, really understand it. And as you see in a bit, this is why we introduced the concept of project categories and our governance roles to make sure that we could do it. These are the Rosetta Stone that ensures that our process is simple and quick for developers. If you make the process difficult for developers, it's game over. They simply won't bother. And on that point, another sort of key tenet that we work to is we want to make it as low friction as possible for developers. That doesn't mean to say the governance is low friction, but it should be below the waterline for where developers are, the governance processes. The governance processes do have to be involved and they've got to be cohesive and all those sorts of good things. So they're not low friction, but from a developer's perspective, they should be all below the waterline. It's got to be codifiable. If you're managing risk and you're trying to make sure that it's a low friction process to developers, to do that, the governance has got to be measurable and testable. So for example, how do you make the decision that a developer can contribute a small bug fix to a library that they use? So our policy says that the library, it has to be an approved library for use at Citi. So it's already got to be approved. It's got to be open sourced under a license which we've approved for contribution. The developer must be in technology, and there's a very good reason for that, which we'll talk a bit about later, and it's got to do with electronic communications. And their manager, who has to be a certain grade, must agree. That's 5 codifiable controls that we can enforce in our tooling, which you saw earlier, Git proxy, and this is why Paul was talking about wanting to introduce rules-based approaches to it. So those are 5 codifiable rules. If you look at our policy, this is how we structured the policy. We made it codifiable. We also require that after a certain period of inactivity, that approval lapses. And in any case, it's got to be recertified by the manager yearly. So we've got codifiable risk measures as well that we can observe and report on. All activities have got to comply with existing regulation and internal company policies at all times. Our training majors on this because this is where the majority of the risk exists. And we'll talk about this in a bit as well. As mentioned, the delegated approach is founded on the governance roles. This ensures at all times it's very clear who is responsible for each aspect of the policy and its compliance. It's very clear to have accountability, very clear accountability, so you can have quick decision making. Risks such as inadvertently leaking intellectual property that's proprietary are continually managed because we don't have this vague approach anymore, I would say. We don't have this vague approach where someone's seen who once gave their permission but they've since left the organization and no one's checking on whether it's still a good thing or not. The governance roles, again, because it's codifiable, if any of these roles lapse, someone leaves or changes role or whatever, that change is observable. And the governance breach has got to be rectified. As I said, governance doesn't need to be low friction, but it does need to be codifiable to make it friction-free for developers. And then respecting communities, that's a core principle as well. We've spoken a lot about in a lot of the sessions today about this. So many of you will be aware of incidents around things like open source hacktivism. And there's significant groundswell of negative opinion against companies who are building successful businesses on the backs of developers giving their time and code for free. And so how might somebody who has been thanklessly maintaining a project for years respond to a pull request from a large company such as Citi? And we had an example of this recently where we were we were consuming a library which was very useful, but in terms of its community health, there hadn't been any PRs responded to in about 2 years. You can't, in that situation, simply go in. There was a community around it who were trying to raise, and there was conversations, raise issues and PRs that weren't being, and there was conversations in the community around this. You can't simply go in and say, oh, we're just going to fork it, and we'll run our own and come over here. We tried to engage with the developer. When the developer didn't respond, we tried to engage with NPM, who were maintaining it, the binary distribution. And eventually, the developer did come back after about 3 or 4 months of us talking in the community. And his life had changed. Things had moved on. And he was very happy for us to take that on. But the approach is really important around respecting communities. When we talk about reputational damage, this is a key one. As is, incidentally, reputational damage, you've got to consider actually expressing an interest in a particular open source library or doing a bug fix against something is a reflection. Even if it's a good bug fix, if it's a project which perhaps doesn't have the best type of community around it, doesn't have a particularly good reputation, that impacts you. You've got to think carefully about that as well. As I said, remember, we're trying to build this low friction approach to allow developers to contribute and also protect the company. Don't expose your developers to processes that can be automated or performed by the OSPO on their behalf. This is key to it. I've spent a lot of years in technology building UIs, UI frameworks, UI platforms. And one of the core tenets of building a UI is if you have a problem, don't make it the user's problem. If you need something to happen, don't give them a button to click. Fix the problem. Same with this. You've got a problem, don't give it to the developer. Fix it with automation and tooling. So having established our principles, we started our policy by defining the risks that we wanted to manage. At the beginning of the policy, this is the first thing that you see. So as you see from the open source policy, these are central to its structure. Everything hinges off these. It's things like data leakage. Data leakage is super important for financial services. It's not the immediate thing you're going to think about. It's things like client data, which brings in all sorts of scary propositions. So we're very clear in our policy. You don't open source data. You shouldn't have test data in your repos. If you do, you have to go through the standard already exists cross-border data policies to open source that. It's very clear, very easy for a developer to follow. Don't put test data in it. So that's where data leakage is so important. Financial loss is an interesting one. Really only applies to, as you'll see later, only applies to the bigger projects. This is very simple. If you've spent time developing a solution, you've put your developers' time into it, there's a cost associated with it. The company has that in their financial accounting systems, and it will need to be written down. We need to be doing that with our eyes open. We discussed intellectual property, but it applies across the board. So we need to be thinking about, this is whether we need to be thinking about doing things like applying for trademarks or patents before we open source to protect the intellectual property. Remember, if you open source under the Apache 2 license, you retain the ownership of it, but you provide a royalty-free perpetual license to use, but you might want to protect it through patents and trademarks and the likes. We mentioned reputational damage. Conflicts of interest, again, we'll see how these map through. There's the concept of project categories. This really is where we're explicit in our policy that we allow developers to contribute to open source in their own personal time, not associated with their work, because that's often a very muddy area. If you look at your employment law and you look at the contracts you sign, everything that you do is owned by your company typically. Well, we are explicit in the policy that you can work on open source in your own time, and that's allowed as long as Citi doesn't have an interest in that project for any reason. But that's where conflict of interest comes in. Same processes apply. Like you've already got conflict of interest policies in your organizations. They're the same ones that apply. You can't do anything that conflicts with your company's business. So you can't go off and work on dark web, dodgy open source that might look bad. And then got governance risks. As I said, these are baked into our policy. So the obvious ones: license compliance. Does this license allow us to contribute in a corporate manner? Do we have to? What are the rules around providing warranties, or what are we liable for? All the normal sort of straightforward things. Non-compliance with other policies is the key one. This is where we start bringing in some of the internal policies. And then we also talk about contribution status and life cycle as a governance risk. So this is abandonware. This is where we need to make sure regularly we are checking that any project that we said we're going to contribute to, it's not just been thrown over the fence and it's been abandoned. We need to actively think about, are we going to archive it? Do we need to talk to the community about somebody else picking up ownership for it? We're not simply about abandoning it, because there's an issue there around all sorts of, many of these other things, including reputational damage. So next we identified the policies and the regulations that are particularly relevant to open source contribution, and we defined how each must be applied to the contribution. It's not all of them, but it's many of the big ones. You've got to ensure that your processes can't be used to circumvent policies or regulations. The big one here is electronic communications, and we've heard questions about this a number of times. And you've got to solve this one. Don't shy away from it. In a regulated industry, in creating the open source policy at Citi, this is what I went to first, very first, headed this one off. Because if this doesn't happen, you can't talk on Slack, you can't contribute to open source. And one of the keys to unlocking this is agreeing at that high level, that senior exec level, that we're going to do open source, that it's critical to our business to do open source. We've agreed it's critical to do open source, haven't we? Right, in which case, certain things have to happen and we've got to figure out how to do it. So electronic communications is really interesting, and every organization interprets this differently and how they manage their risk. But the root of this is the regulations that control the broker-dealer relationship in a financial services organization. And the way that we handled it is through a bunch of project categories that we'll talk through. But essentially, and this is why we limit, remember the 5 codifiable checks? This is why we limit it to technology employees, because technology cannot be part of the broker-dealer relationship. You think about traders who code. They cannot contribute to open source. It's forbidden. If anyone in the business wants to contribute to open source, they go through their technology organization, which provides the controls and balances. We'll touch on that in a little bit more and explain how we do this. So Compliance can be really, really difficult, but I know I've majored on this a bit about the frictionless process or the low friction process. Forgetting the developer kills this opportunity immediately. These use cases are all very different. Each has differing and varying levels of risk. And again, this is why we structured the policy the way that we did, because different levels of risk require different levels of governance and levels of ceremony. And the challenge was creating a policy that could be tailored to them all without that one-size-fits-all, high friction, got to get an MD to look at every line of code you open source type approach. So having identified the risks, the relevant regulations and policies that we had to hit, we then categorized the contribution activities based on those risks. And we created these 4 categories. So that, for instance, there's a lot less risk, as we're saying, associated with a small bug fix to an existing library than there is if we open source a complete solution. So by aligning the level of risk to the project category, we also define the level of governance that's required for that category and the roles that are needed to manage that governance. So for example, if we want to get involved with a large project, perhaps join a foundation, sign a CCLA, attend working groups, that engagement requires, in our policy, a role of project administrator, an open source project administrator, to ensure that we're doing things correctly. Their job is to make sure we're engaged with that project in the right way, that we've signed all the stuff that needs to be done. Their job is to know who's working on that project. Their job is to know why we're working on that project and on all the activities that are going on. And we delegate the governance down to those role levels in order to keep it close to the decision-making, close to the people who really understand what's going on. But you don't need a project administrator, an open source project administrator, for bug fixes to an individual libraries, which are likely to be highly infrequent. And so these categories provide the guardrails, if you like, for our internal and regulation policy. So you think about electronic communications, and I keep coming back to this one because it's such an important one. The categories on the categories 2, 3, and 4, so major interest, minor interest, and personal, these are us working in standard, generic, open source solutions. That is nothing to do with our broker-dealer relationship. Therefore, and we have this agreed, that is not relevant to our electronics communications policy. What does that mean? It means developers can talk on Slack. There's a caveat to it. Bearing in mind, you mustn't let your solutions and your approach be a way to circumvent policy. You can talk on Slack, but you've got to do it outside the network. That's the control. So you can't exfiltrate anything. But of course, you've also covered the area of data leakage with that as well, because if you're outside the network, and this is another key piece, when the risk folks talk to you about, well, how are you managing like leaking data? If they're working outside the network, like, that's a solved problem. Like, there's other people deal with that. There's our email systems. There's our firewalls. Like, that's a solved problem. If you're saying that's not a solved problem, we got a different problem. We're not making that situation any worse. Data leakage prevention is another area where these categories help tailor. So the size of contribution. If you've got a minor interest project, so bearing in mind this is the developer who's creating a bug fix to a project that's already approved, that their manager's looked at, and their manager has a certain level of seniority. And by the way, that seniority is fairly low. Like, it's mid-level. It's not really senior. If that's a 100 meg contribution, it's not a bug fix, okay? And you can codify that stuff. You can catch that stuff really, really easily. And so you can codify it based upon those sorts of things. And the same with personal contribution. We're very clear in our policy. Yes, you can do personal contribution. We require, if you're contributing on behalf of Citi, so one of these first 3 categories, that your commits are tagged with your Citi email address. And again, that was an interesting, people were a bit worried about that. But no, actually, We want two things to happen. One, the attribution has to go to the developer. Two, we want it to be very clear that this is from Citi, because Citi is the one that has the interest in it. If you're doing a personal contribution, it's got to be outside the network, and you must not use your Citi email address. So again, like there's very clear codifiable rules around this. So there's many risks. We've spoken about the risks, and that almost always all of them will appear in all of the buckets, but some are more important than the others based on this type of activity. And so this is how we start. This is when we started categorizing the risks that apply to each of those project categories. And it's a fairly straightforward approach. In personal, it's conflict of interest is the big one. You can't be working on anything which is listed as a project that's either moderated, interest, or minor. Right? If Citi has expressed an interest in it, it's done. You've got to do it inside the network. You've got to go through the governance process. Actually going to clarify that. All of our activities can happen either inside or outside of the network, except for personal, which must happen outside the network. So as a developer, you can work completely outside of the Citi network on any of these categories. We don't stop you doing that. In many cases, if you're chatting on Slack and raising issues and those sorts of things, it's much easier just to stay outside. But the governance still applies to it. You can't do it, and bearing in mind, you should be adhering to all of these policies, and you must be putting your Citi email address on it. We can track those types of activities. And then non-compliance with company policy is obviously a big one. The rules here are the same. We major on this in our training. Most of our training, we'll talk a little bit about the training side of things, but most of our training focuses on educating developers around these risks. Like, don't conflict with any of the Citi policies. Think about your use of social media. It applies to Slack as everything else. We're explicit about the things that you've got to bear in mind, the policies, the conflict of interest, as I mentioned, things like use of social media. And so these risks will sit in all of them, but the level of governance is lower for the lower risk, smaller items that you can manage. Intellectual property will tend to apply to the bigger ones. If it's a small bug fix, if it's a line of code or whatever, you're not really worried about intellectual property for that. And finally, we define the governance levels that apply to each of these categories. So the checks that we need to do as part of our governance process, tailored to each of the project category and applying that appropriate level of governance. So things like, if you want to request to do a moderated project, we're going to open source a big project of our own, fine. But that's got to go through financial approval. We've got to check whether we need to be applying for trademarks or patents. Are we committed to this project? And actually, in this case, these types of projects, they need an MD sponsor. Bearing in mind the governance roles, like the MD doesn't have to sign off every line of code, but the MD has to say, yeah, I'm happy that we do or don't need to apply for trademarks or patents. I am going to put people onto this to maintain this project so that Citi doesn't suffer reputational damage as a result of chucking something over a wall and leaving it and abandoning it. And I accept the financial write-down on it. So this is our governance is tailored to each of these, and as you can see, we kind of move down through the areas. And some of these, like there's a ... at the moment, but some of these apply to all of them. So intellectual property review, every line of code that goes out for a moderated project, it's checked thoroughly beforehand. It goes through our same processes that we follow for publishing anything. So we have our internal teams who look at the media that we publish, review all of these things. Every line of code has to be checked before it goes out. Less so for major interest because they tend to be smaller. But actually, even major interest, what we're saying there is that Citi has a major interest in this. We actually like to be part of the story. We'd like a seat at the table. So again, it needs an MD sign-off. When you go down to minor, the governance is very, very much delegated close to the engineers who are actually working on it. So having defined the appropriate levels of risk management for each project category, the roles were defined to create this accountability. These aren't all the roles. The roles are listed in the open sourced policy that we provided. And remember, attribution accountability of risk is what matters here. Clarity over decisions, the anti-paralysis, keeping the decision making as close to the development teams as possible. So there's a number of roles that we assign. Project maintainer, if it's a Citi moderated, we have to have a project maintainer. Somebody, that's an official role. We align these as closely as possible with open source roles. In the case of project maintainer, for example, it is exactly what it says. Project administrator, sponsors, we kind of discussed about this. So there's that delegated governance process. So how do we ensure it's enforceable? Just checking time, because I'm close. So we defined a policy that codifies how we want to manage risk, appropriate levels of governance, dependent on the types of contribution. How do we make it enforceable? So our policy also requires a standard set of tooling. Remember, we have one policy. So it's a standard set of tooling, and we call it Git proxy. You'll have seen some demos around that. So whether you choose to use Git proxy or build your own, we decided compliance means the tooling has to do these three things. Project inventory. We need a list of every project that we've had approved, who's been approved to work on it, and the contribution activities that are going through it. Need a license inventory, approved licenses, the licenses that we've allowed for contribution. And then the IP data leakage platform, which Git proxy provides. And as you heard from Paul earlier in the session, a lot of this tooling is being built into Git proxy. Git proxy becomes the source of truth for it. It can be difficult, but there are a few things that it must do. So it must be accurate and easily auditable, history of compliance, and you've got to periodically review all the risk and non-compliance. So we build this into the process. It's not a one and done. You don't do it as soon as a project is approved and then it's done. We periodically reevaluate. And then there's a few things that you should do, and we want to look at automating these processes. Paul did the demo on that. It's very much still a work in progress, but the aim is to implement these rules codified. Critical functions such as the maker, checker, peer review process are implemented in it. And some of the key aspects around automated code scanning rules. Our governance is largely speaking manual outside of this, but it doesn't go into Git proxy, and so you can't start contributing until it's approved. But as I said, with the tooling approach, we want to build all of this automated into Git proxy. Ultimately, what we want to aim for is if you imagine a developer doing a bug fix, we'd love to get to a point where developer does a Git clone. We know automatically now everything we need to know about that developer. We know who they are, we know who the manager is, we know whether the project is approved for use, we know what its license is. We can pre-approve the vast majority of stuff. So when they come to do a Git push, we're ready. And it should be that simple. Training, very briefly on this, because I know we're up to time. As I mentioned, our training majors on the things that matter, the risks that matter, that developers need to understand. It is non-compliance with policy, regulation, understanding the implications of licenses, describing the roles that are involved in the approvals that they'll need. It's not mandatory within Citi to take the training, but it is mandatory if you want to do contribution. And that's codified into Git proxy as well. There's a check that happens that doesn't allow you to contribute if you've not taken the training. And that's pretty much it. It's a lot to think about. There's a ton involved. So don't stress about it too much, but hopefully it's useful to you. I know we're out on time for questions. I'm happy to take one or two, though, if you can, or catch up with me afterwards. And that's it. Thank you very much.